Welcome to Quiet Scare, where horror doesn't scream, it whispers. There's something about a true story that makes the hair on my arms stand up in a way fiction just can't. I think it's because these stories are about the things that happen in the dark spaces, the bits of reality that don't quite fit. It's finding that sweet spot where the fear is there, but it's quiet, maybe a little dreamy, and just sort of settles in. Tonight, the stories are all from the road, tales of trucks and truckers, of strange convoys and unsettling rest stops, and of the things that can happen when the world gets thin. This is the first of a 3-week series on trucker horror stories. The channel appreciates when people like and subscribe. It truly helps a lot, for sure. Hit that bell notification so you know when the next one drops. There are some ads in the first 10 to 15 minutes, but after that there are no more interruptions for the rest of the night. Sleep well and dream dark. I drove west with the window cracked an inch, letting a thin line of cold night air run across my knuckles. The air bit. The cab smelled like coffee gone sweet and burnt, same as it always did after the third cup. Past the green exit signs and the low spill of warehouse light, the road through eastern Oklahoma ran flat and unbothered. My dispatcher had said the load would be sensitive and soundy when we'd talked that afternoon. Keep it moving. No curiosity, no heroics. I'd heard that kind of talk for 29 years. It wasn't special. The trailer showed up in the background noise a few miles after I passed the Choctaw Road sign. Every truck has its voice, tie-downs clicking. A bad bushing thunking at the same seam of pavement. So I waited to learn the pitch and pattern. A faint rustle, something harder, the thud that is more hand than cargo. I ran through the usual list. Loose pallet, bad strap, a cage sliding a notch, and I marked each one off in my head like I was checking mirrors. The list ended and the sound didn't. I pictured steel cages with chew marks and lab tags, and bored animals throwing themselves against the wire. That image helped for a while. Wind nudged the rig once, and I felt a small tapping through the frame, like someone running fingers along a wall. I turned up the radio, and then turned it back down. It was a clear night, temperature dropping, the kind of air that makes breath a little visible even in a cab. Somewhere to my left, a late freight slid by with its stack lights winking out in the dark. Everything should have felt ordinary. The sounds changed. Scratches landed in clusters. Something struck metal in a quick, uneven pattern that wasn't the rhythm of road joints. There were pauses you could fit a breath into. I knew how a crate shifts. I knew how a loose pallet answers a curve. This wasn't that. I pulled off at a truck stop on the north side of Norman and parked on the far end where the sodium lights thinned out. I killed the engine and sat with my hands on the wheel. The quiet multiplied everything. The sounds from the trailer were clearer without the engine. A scrape, a clatter, a stutter that could have been someone trying not to cry. I tried to file it under noise and told myself to act like I'd been paid to act. Keep rolling, keep quiet. On the way around to the back, I noticed my left boot was untied. That's a small thing, but I felt it. I stepped on the lace twice. The sort of thing you correct without thinking when your head is in the right place. I stood in the orange glow and retied it with hands that weren't steady. The trailer's doors were ordinary swing doors with a metal bar and a steel pin lock. The tamper seal was a red plastic tail printed with a serial. The number meant nothing to me. The red seal had a serial I read and immediately lost. The way numbers fall out of your head when you know they belong to forms and not to you. If a nurse had told me those were lab dogs, if a man in a lab coat had signed my manifest, I might have gotten back in and driven. But the paperwork had been fuzzier than that. Just biome supplies from a distributor off a frontage road. The man who brought the pallets had avoided the light. He'd spoken through a scarf. Those details had felt like the usual corners shaved by people trying to make their own schedules. I filed them as inconvenient. Not wrong. The lines you draw for yourself are simple. When you're looking ahead through a windshield, they get bent when you're standing at the doors. Someone inside knocked. 3 short taps and then silence as if waiting for a reply. The sound died into the steel and then into my chest. Air turned colder along my teeth. I stood angled to the right door, an arm's length back from the hinges, keeping my body out of the beam of the lot light so I wasn't a shape filling the gap. I stepped back from the doors and checked the lot. A man in a hoodie smoked outside the convenience store and watched his phone. A reefer ran a few lanes over with its rhythmic hum. The night didn't care what I did. I went back to the cab and took the bolt cutters from the cubby under the passenger seat. They were the long kind with faded red handles that I'd carried since my kids were still in grade school. I lifted them and then set them down, and then lifted them again. I nicked my thumb on the latch, pulling the cutters free. A tiny sting. It made everything else feel louder. There's a simple rule you learn out here. Whatever you break is on you. A broken seal can cost you work. A broken lock can end you in court. I didn't think about court as much as I thought about losing the only rhythm I knew. Miles behind me, miles ahead. The pleasant numbness of useful labor. When the cutters met the lock, I expected a fight. It went quick. The seal took longer. My breathing got louder in my ears. Only one part of me stayed steady. The part that puts a tool on a thing and makes it move. The same part that has changed a tire at 2 a.m. in a prairie wind. When the bar came loose and I swung the right door open, the first thing that hit me was the air. It had that sweet sour smell you know from forgotten fridges and old barns, with a sharp top note of metal and fear. Cold air spilled out, and then the warmer breath of the trailer met it, a damp heat that fogged in the beam, and then thinned like it didn't want to be seen. I raised my phone and hit the flashlight, squinting against the bounce of light on aluminum walls. They were along both sides, fixed to anchor points with heavy chain. 17 I counted later, but in the first seconds they were not numbers. They were faces in small circles of light, skin ashy, hair stuck to cheeks. Eyes too open. Someone had tied strips of cloth around wrists to keep metal from cutting into them. A boy sat with his legs hooked under him like he was holding in heat. A woman had both hands cupped around another woman's shoulder. Several looked at me and then looked down. The chains ran to recessed D-rings along the rails. The same fittings meant for pallets and equipment, turned to another use. In the center aisle were plastic tubs stacked 3 high like you could keep winter sweaters in them. One lid was cracked from the inside. There were water jugs, 2 of them half empty. A bucket had tipped in a corner. Rope lay in coils, the kind you buy at a hardware store because it's cheap. Every ordinary thing in that trailer had been used for an unordinary purpose. I did not speak. I don't know if I could have made a sound that didn't sound like the wrong thing. A girl with a knit hat pulled low over her ears blinked hard, and I understood that my face was the whole frame right then. The person at the end of a corridor, the body in a doorway. My phone shook in my hand as I dialed. The dispatcher tone gave way to a human who asked me to say where I was. I read the mile marker sign I'd clocked while pulling in, and the name of the exit, Tecumseh Road, like I was reading off a grocery list. I said there were people. I said chains. I didn't label the crime. The labels came later when other people needed to put it in a system. Do not open further, the voice told me. Do not remove restraints. Stay with the vehicle. Officers are on the way. The words had a practiced shape. My breath fogged the screen. I said yes and stood with the door half open to keep air moving. I told my hands to lower. They kept making small movements in the cold. Minutes stretch at a different rate when you're measuring them against the need of the people in front of you. I tried to think of a blanket in the cab, and then thought of how much harm I could do by offering the wrong kind of help. I saw a little boy press both palms flat to the floor to steady the shiver in his legs. I saw a woman's lips move without sound. The noises from the bodies were small and exact. Shifts against metal, the dry slide of chain, a cough someone swallowed. I felt a heat prickle at the back of my neck that wasn't from weather. My throat tasted like pennies. The road noise just beyond the lot went on being indifferent. Blue light came first, flashing off the stainless of the tanker parked 2 rows over and painting the gravel with color. The sound of the siren was muted, a short burst less for style than for telling those who needed to hear that help had arrived. The cruiser rolled to a stop a car length away and idled. The door opened. A uniformed woman stepped out and stood with her hand near, but not on her radio. She stopped 2 car lengths off, set her feet, and waited a second that felt intentional, space given before approach. The officer didn't rush. That mattered. She looked from me to the open door, and then to my hands. I said I had cut the lock. My voice came out flat. She nodded once and radioed, pausing between phrases. Another set of lights drew near. Then an ambulance's white box with its clean angles. One of the paramedics stood a careful distance and asked no questions. A second officer arrived, and the first lifted a hand to hold him back, long enough to set the cadence of the next minutes. The space filled slowly with bodies that knew how to move in small places without causing harm. The chains were looked at, not immediately touched. A pen light clicked on. An inventory began that used no names. I stepped aside and picked up the bolt cutters with one hand, not sure if I should hide them or present them like a confession. No one asked for them. No one spoke to me for a minute or two, which felt like longer. The world narrowed to measured actions. An officer putting on gloves, a paramedic clipping open a bag, the careful choice of words that asked, "Can you move?" without requiring a yes. It was plain. No drama, no push. There are hours of that night I could make larger or smaller in memory. The first cut chain, the first hand freed, and then held, not grabbed. The first sip of water spilt down a chin because it had been too fast. The sound of a blanket unrolled on metal, and the sigh of a body lowered to it. The fact that I had not noticed before how loud an oxygen zipper sounds when it opens in the quiet of a parking lot. Somewhere a reefer cycled, and in that half second the pitch aligned with the trailer's earlier knocking, close enough to catch in my throat before it slid past. What stayed clear was how little anyone said beyond what was necessary. No one told a story. They don't give you the story there, and you shouldn't be asking for it. In the backwash of headlights, I saw faces soften by degrees into something like safety, which is not the same as peace. I counted bodies as they crossed the threshold and blinked in the light. Counted because I had to hold on to numbers if I wasn't going to float away when they were all out. The trailer looked larger than it had with them inside. The walls showed the marks of shoes and hands. A length of chain lay on the floor, with one link pulled into an oval. My flashlight beam skated over a sticker with a barcode that said nothing useful to me. A paramedic stepped up into the empty space and swept with her light for anything that would need to be bagged. She found nothing anyone called evidence in my hearing. They would find what mattered later in offices and databases. Right then, what mattered had breath. I slept in the cab at the far end of the lot after the last ambulance pulled out. A different officer had asked me to wait until someone could take my statement. I did what I was told. The heater clicked on and off, and my teeth buzzed with too much coffee and not enough. I closed my eyes and saw metal. I opened them and stared at the small crack in the plastic of my dashboard where a screwdriver had slipped years ago. The ordinary flaw grounded me. Dawn didn't so much arrive as collect itself along the edges of things. A line of pink came up over the fields. The hood of my truck took on that soft matte look it gets when the first light hits frost. A road crew passed, towing a flashing arrow. The world returned to tasks. A detective, not in a suit, just a jacket with a badge clipped to the pocket, knocked on the cab door with 2 soft taps and stepped back so I wouldn't startle. He gave a name that I immediately forgot and asked me to tell it again from the beginning. I kept to the steps, the sound, the stop, the seal, the call. He wrote in a small book and didn't interrupt. When I got to the part where the door opened, I stopped talking because there was no way to put what I saw into the size of a word that can be carried that early in the morning. He didn't ask me to fill the gap. He nodded once and closed the book. Before I left, I walked to the back of the trailer on my own and pulled the right door shut. The metal bar came up into my hands and slid home with a clean clack, the same sound it makes after any loadout. My hands remembered the motion before my head did. I set the cut lock on the bumper and left it there. I wiped a thin line of frost from the bar with the side of my hand and watched it melt to water and disappear. I backed the rig into gear and rolled slow out of the lot, looking 3 times before I pulled onto the frontage road. I did not turn on the radio. The quiet felt like something I owed. You can say 17 people lived because a man did a thing and called a number. That's true enough for a sentence. It is smaller than what happened. What happened was that the ordinary world showed all the places where it could be bent by those who wanted to hide something in it, and then this once, it bent back. On the first long straight stretch, I raised the window the last inch and let the cold in until my eyes watered and I could see clear. The shoulder at mile marker 114. I was hauling palletized drywall out of the panhandle, pointed north before midnight, the kind of hour when routine becomes the only fence around your head. The sky was clear and dry. The radio was low. The heater fan made that soft rattle it always makes when the vents are half open. When I nudged the vent wheel, the rattle shifted to a brief chirp, like something small trapped and then gone. I kept a bottle of water between the seats and a bag of sunflower seeds to stay busy. Every few miles, the reflectors in the lane lines stepped back at me like small animal eyes. Somewhere north of Duma, the CB picked up a call I didn't recognize. It wasn't a voice I knew, and it wasn't one of the big company dispatch tones. The words were clipped. Numbers. A time that had already passed. A meetup for formation. I let it ride past. Same as the occasional prank or skip that drifts in from nowhere when the air is right. The road doesn't run on courtesy when it gets late. It runs on habits. Traffic thinned. The night pulled taut. I watched the white posts on the right shoulder tick by in steady measures. I don't remember when the first truck took shape ahead. It was just there after a slight crest, a dark rectangle with a smaller dark shape behind it, and another farther out. No marker lights, no brake flashes when we reached a dip. No side reflections from mile markers, just outline upon outline moving. I checked my mirrors. In the right one, the side of my trailer went on and on. In the left, there were shadows falling in behind me, where there had been open lane. The radio popped like a fingertip on glass, and went back to a steady hush. More air than voice. My hand stayed at 10 and 2. The sunflower seeds tasted like dust. The smell of hot rubber arrived before I found a cause. It was faint, like when you pass a burned out shoulder and only the memory of the heat remains. My tack stayed where it should. Coolant temp was steady. I told myself it was farmland, maybe somebody burning brush far off. I cracked the driver's window enough to bleed in colder air. The smell didn't change. We climbed a long grade. That's when it became clear we were matching one another without any of the usual human noise. No dramatics, no jockeying. The trucks kept a precise gap front and back, as if a ruler had fixed the distance in inches and not 1 inch could change. When I signaled to move left around the front unit, there was no flash of brights in acknowledgement. When I eased right to give a passing car space, there was no passing car, just my turn signal blinking into a dark that absorbed it. It felt wrong, like holding a door that opened by itself. I watched the center line through the soft halo of my headlamps. The paint looked wetter than it should be, though the day had been dry and the radio had promised clear. A wind came across the cab from the driver's side, a narrow gust that didn't stir the scrub to the left of the right-of-way. The truck ahead upshifted without noise. I felt my own foot add throttle I hadn't meant to give. I tried to name each piece of equipment around me that usually brings things back to normal. Flatbed, box, tanker, grain hopper. You count and classify, and it's a way of saying, I am here, I am awake, I'm a person in a machine. But the shapes refused to hold a make or model. They were always a little off-roof, too low, back too square, long hood, then cab over, then nothing you could use in a story. It was like looking into fog that only exists against metal. The idea came on me to try the shoulder. There's a wide one near a county road turnout, I remembered. The old map in my head said so. My memory put it roughly 2 miles ahead by the pace of the lane dots. I set my intent and waited for the right moment. I put the right turn signal on. The dash arrow blinked at a slower tempo than I knew it had. An unhurried metronome that didn't care about the lane. Lightness came in my palms at the wheel. It took me a second to realize I wasn't pushing against anything. The power steering felt over-eager, then loose. The kind of feel that comes when you're creeping along in a freight yard and the truck would rather drift than track. But we were at highway speed. My stomach gave a slow roll. In the passenger seat, my phone was face down where I'd left it. The lock screen buzz had startled me earlier in the night, so I'd turned the sound off. A thought drifted up. A text from home about a morning drop-off time for school. A note about who needed which snacks. It wasn't panic, it was a picture of ordinary light. I brought the scene closer. Our kitchen. The dish towel always a little damp. The smell of the dog's paws after he trots in from the yard. I ran through the order of tomorrow, step by step. Dull details that fit only our house. My fingers found weight again. The wheel firmed. The engine note came back into the center of my hearing. When the next wide shoulder opened near a county road turnoff, one of those green signs with 2 letters and no town name. I took it. A green sign before it used 2 letters and nothing else. The kind you see where farm grids cut the prairie. The posts were fresh. The ditch was shallow. I had enough room if I didn't fight the angle. I eased off the throttle and felt the smell grow heavier for a second, as if whoever had been carrying it had leaned closer. For a breath, the wheel lightened again, and the hot rubber smell pressed closer, as if the night had leaned into the cab and was waiting to see what I'd do. The truck ahead made a small movement, right wheels kissing the paint, and kept on. The gap behind tightened to the same measurement it had always held. I held the wheel and gave the brakes a long, even press. The pedal felt live under my boot. The nose dipped. Vibration translated through the column. The honest kind you get when pavement turns to the rough edge of shoulder. The reflectors became brighter up close. I could see the grit there, the small stones that pinged my fenders. In the left mirror, the lane was clean for 3 markers. In the right, the trailer edge rode true with a hand's width to spare. The trailer settled true. We slowed. The convoy slid past in the left lane. I saw them first in my driver's window, then in the mirror, one after another, camouflaged as trucks if you didn't look directly at the lack. Always the same space between. No plates I could make sense of. No sticker that belonged to a region. In the cab of the second one, something shifted toward my sight line. A figure where a driver should be turned its head in a tidy, deliberate way, as if checking a gauge on its right. There was no light inside for me to read more than outline, where a face should have been. The dark reflected my own headlamp glow back at me in a dull pain, so even the idea of features wouldn't hold. I put the truck in neutral and set the brake. The engine ticked down. The smell eased back to faint. The last of them went by with the same clean distance, the same refusal to claim the night with light. When they were gone, the wind came across from the fields and carried the dry, plain smell you expect. Dust, a hint of feed, cold earth. I sat on the shoulder with my hands in my lap until my breathing matched the heater fan. A state trooper's cruiser came down from the north after a while and rolled past without stopping. There was a pause at a far turnout where his taillights came together and separated again, as if he had half decided to loop back. He kept on. I watched my clock. 10 minutes, give or take. Though the way the minute hand moved reminded me of watching a kettle that refuses to boil. The radio stuttered once. I turned the volume all the way down and left it there. A pickup blew by, towing an empty car hauler. The red reflectors on the hauler winked at me normal, ordinary, and then disappeared into what the road already knew how to do. When I pulled back onto the highway, the sense of the truck being a shade too light had gone. The steering had weight. My own head did too. The mile markers ticked up without trick. At a big travel center before town, I took the exit and pulled under the lights. They were bright and flat, and took all the mystery out of my paint. I topped off my thermos with fresh coffee that tasted like it had been made 10 minutes before, the way good luck tastes. Inside, a woman at the counter had a bowl of hard candy set next to the receipts. A couple of refrigerated cases hummed. Under a corkboard near the restrooms, someone had posted a flyer about a small-town parade. I asked if there had been any chatter about a convoy on the road that night. The woman squinted like she was deciding whether to make it a joke. She didn't. Older drivers talk about a rundown from Springfield to Lamar, she said, not quite looking at me. Late night, no lights kind of thing. People call it all sorts of names. You know how stories are. I said maybe it was fatigue. I said maybe I'd misread folks running dark. She looked at my boots, then at the clock above the coffee urn. It gets thin out there, she said. Thin in the middle of the night. Stay sharp. I finished my coffee in the cab with the door cracked. A refrigerated unit on the next lane cycled on with a clatter, then smoothed into its own steady whir. The smell here was diesel and hot concrete. I could work with those. I texted home to say I'd be late and that I was taking a break. A sticker on my dash had curled at one corner. I pressed it flat without thinking, and it didn't stay. I rubbed the edge with my thumb until the glue felt tacky again, and let it go. The rest of the run into Denver was clean. Nothing drifted where it shouldn't. The sun came up behind me and made the mirrors bright. Traffic picked up near E470, the way it always does. I watched the same pickup with the empty car hauler pass me again near the airport cutoff, and he waved in that way that says somebody else has somewhere to be too. I don't take that stretch north of midnight anymore, unless dispatch makes it unavoidable, and then I made sure I'd slept and eaten like a person with sense. The radio stayed quiet. If something was organizing out in the darkness, it could do it without me. There are groups you fall in with because it's safer, and there are groups that ask for something you can't afford to give. Every so often, a late run put me on a different prairie highway, and a line of unlit shapes formed farther out than they should be able to hold. Most times they turned into grain trucks with a headlight out, or a pair of box vans tailing each other home to a yard. I kept my eyes on the paint, on the numbers, on small things I owned. The promise I made to myself at that wide shoulder was simple. If it went thin, I pulled over where the earth was plain and waited until the world was thick again. I knew what it felt like when something wanted to measure me in inches and keep me there. I didn't want to know what came after. The vanishing on Route 84. By the time the leaves were half gone and the air had that dull metallic edge, the warehouse heaters ticked before they actually warmed anything. I was counting hours by receipts and taillights. We hauled pallets for grocery chains across the region, and November meant longer nights and longer routes. I was at my desk that Wednesday, wrapping rubber bands around delivery slips, when my phone buzzed against an old coffee stain. It was one of my drivers, Pat. We had our routine check-ins and the occasional text about way stations, but he didn't just call. Not after hours, not like this. I answered, expecting a question about a load number or a gate code. All I got was breath, slow at first, then shorter, muffled by the soundproofing of a cab. He said he was being followed. He didn't explain how he knew. He did not need to. Panic thickened his words until I could hear my own pulse creep into my ears. I told him to get off the interstate somewhere public, somewhere with other people around, lock the cab doors, call the police. He asked what to do if they pulled next to him. I didn't know. I told him to keep moving until he saw lights. I told him to call me back once he was safe. The office went small and too bright after the call ended. I could see the green LED clock over the dispatch window and nothing else. It was past 9, the time we usually shut off the fluorescents. I left them on. I paced between the filing cabinet and the door, then stood still because pacing felt too loud. No one else was there. I thought about his kid. A baby, really. The photo he taped inside his cab. I thought about how a person can be as reliable as a torque wrench for years, and then sound like an empty bottle all of a sudden. He called back. His voice was flatter, like he'd done a long hold of breath and let it go without noticing. He told me he'd pulled into a rest area off the interstate near Vernon, one of those older pull-offs with cracked asphalt and vending machines that blinked the wrong time. He said it was dark and quiet. He said he didn't see anyone around. He sounded embarrassed. I told him to stay put if it felt safe, or move 2 exits if it didn't. Keep the doors locked. Call the police. I told him I was coming. I grabbed my jacket off the back of my chair, and the keys that always fell between the staplers. I left the amber office light on, because turning it off would have felt like shutting my eyes. The night outside was the kind that swallowed sound. My car's engine seemed overeager against it. I pulled onto the frontage road and then the on-ramp and watched the city's sodium glow fall away in the rear view, until there was nothing but lanes and guardrail and black. 30 minutes is not long. It is just long enough to notice that every other car has somewhere else to be, except this stretch of highway. The white lane reflectors came and went like a metronome. The sound in my head was not my engine. It was the thwack of a loose strap against a trailer door, the way it smacks metal in a crosswind. I kept thinking I heard it, just behind me, just there, just once. I breathed through it. I passed an exit sign for a place I didn't know, then a sign for a rest area in 2 miles. I checked the clock. I checked my mirrors. My mouth tasted like copper. I saw the truck before I saw the rest area sign again. It sat crooked in the shoulder like it had been left mid-thought. The headlights were still on, angled toward the low scrub, and a chain-link fence. The driver's side door was wide open. The hazard lights were off. The trailer, a white 48-footer, took up more than its share of the shoulder in the right lane, and the brand logo on the side looked out of place there, as if your own name had been written inside a stranger's house. Cold air pushed against my shins as I stepped into the beam. The gravel there had a thin bite of frost, and each step made a dry, powdery crunch that seemed too loud for the empty shoulder. I pulled up 50 feet behind and left my own headlights on. I didn't want to kill them and be left with the soft, blank dark. The air was colder when I stepped out than it had been a minute earlier. I told myself that was because I had been sitting with the heat on. Gravel shifted under my shoes. The sound did not carry. It just fell at my feet and stayed there. Pat? I called without meaning to raise my voice. I did not say his last name. I walked to the open door of the cab and put a hand on the grab bar, because my balance felt wrong. The cabin smelled like coffee and winter air and something else I couldn't place. The keys were still in the ignition. The dash display glowed trip miles, oil pressure, a thin bar for fuel. His thermos was wedged in its usual spot. His jacket, the heavy canvas one with the torn cuff, was hung on the back of the seat. The curtain to the sleeper was pushed aside. The bed was made badly, a blanket half tucked, which is exactly how he made it, every time. I told myself to look for him on the grass berm, at the picnic tables beyond the trees, wherever there was any human shape to be had. I called his name again, smaller this time. The highway behind me was empty all the way to the next rise, where the road tilted and disappeared into a colder piece of sky. When I turned to look along the shoulder, the light from my car cut a flat wedge into the weeds. A crumpled paper cup lay there, caught in an old tire rut. It made a dry sound in the wind. I could still hear the other sound, the thwack that wasn't there. I looked at my phone and realized my hands were shaking. The screen smeared my thumbprint into a pale oval. I dialed. The dispatcher's voice was measured. When I said his name, the tone shifted. Not surprised, exactly, but ready. She told me he had called them minutes ago. He told them a car had pulled into the same rest area where he was parked. He was told to drive away. He did. She said there was a scream, then nothing. She used words like recorded and advised, and officers en route. I agreed to wait at the truck. When the line clicked off, I stood with the phone still at my ear and counted to 10 without knowing why. The beam from my car's headlights picked up the flake of dust drifting in the cab and made it look like weather. I put my phone in my pocket, then took it out because leaving it put away felt like tempt fate. I climbed up into the cab. The seat gave a familiar squeak and released a bit of the air from its suspension. I shut the driver's door to stop the wind from pulling at the map that was flapping on the console. The interior settled. Before I could think too long about it, I clicked the lock button for both doors. Then I unlocked them because it felt wrong to change anything. My own face looked strange in the window. I ran a finger along the edge of the desk shelf above the dashboard and found the receipt book. His handwriting tilted like it always did. There was an apple core in a plastic bag, a pack of gum with 2 pieces left. I saw the baby picture taped to the dash with a corner lifting. The adhesive had picked up lint. Nothing was out of place in a way that could be measured. No torn fabric, no scuff that didn't belong. Just a careful quiet that felt arranged by no one. I left the door open again when I climbed down. Old habits. Air drifted out, warmer than outside, but not by much. I looked down the shoulder again. Beyond the scrappy trees, the utility easement cut a straight line into the dark, filled with dead grass and broken bottles. It was the kind of place teenagers came during the day and deer came at night. I listened for any movement and heard only a groan of a metal sign in the wind and that elastic phantom thwack, which I now realized was probably a loose strap somewhere along the trailer roof. Or I told myself that. Blue lights appeared on the highway a long way off, and then were there all at once, as they always seem to be when you need them. The cruiser slowed on the approach. The driver's side spotlight came on, swung and held off to the right instead of blinding me. The officer sat a beat in the car, then another beat standing behind the open door, then walked toward me. Something about those pauses made the space fill with a little more air, like oxygen returning to a room. He asked me my name and whether the truck was mine, and whether I was the one who had called. He looked into the cab before I did again. He had a flashlight but kept the beam low. For a moment no one spoke. The radio at his shoulder hissed and settled, and somewhere beyond the trees a loose sign tapped twice and then went quiet again. Another unit pulled in behind the first, and that second officer stood near the back of the trailer a moment, like a shadow that thought it had found a body to belong to, and hadn't. The first one asked if I had touched anything. I said I had climbed in. He nodded, like he knew I would have. He asked when I last spoke with Pat. He asked whether Pat had said anything about who was following him or what the car looked like. I shook my head without answering at first because it felt like the act of putting sound into the space would change its shape. Then I told him what I knew. He wrote in a small notebook without looking down much. He kept one hand on the radio at his shoulder. It clicked once, and he answered without looking at me. They asked for permission to search the cab. I gave it. The second officer went around to the passenger side and opened that door. The dome light came on in the way it always did, soft and a little late. They did not pull anything out. They didn't have to. There was nothing to pull. A tow truck arrived a half hour later. The driver stood with us a while, hands in pockets, looking like a man who had done this on holidays and in bad weather, and could separate the sadness from the work, only because if he didn't, he would never sleep. He said nothing to me. He put the hooks on the front, and when the truck rocked, the loose mat finally slid onto the floor. I bent to pick it up and left it where it lay. I didn't trust my own hands. I called his wife from my car before the hauling was finished. I didn't want to. She had a voice that always sounded like it had just been laughing, and now it didn't. I told her as steadily as I could that he was missing, and that the police were with me and were doing everything they could. She asked if he had said anything to me. I repeated the plainest version, the least harmful shape of it I could find. I heard her move in the kitchen, cupboard doors opening and closing as if she might find him among the plates. I told her not to drive. I told her I'd come to her when I left here. I said his name wrong the first time. I said it right the second. They let me go around midnight. The tow truck left with our trailer, its taillights drawing 2 red lines into the distance. The officers stayed behind a few minutes longer, using their flashlights in places that hadn't needed light for years. When I finally put my hands back on my steering wheel, I saw that they had left a dust print on the leather where my fingers hadn't been clean. I wiped it with my sleeve. It didn't come off. Days moved in pieces after that. I answered calls from numbers I didn't know. I drove to the yard at odd hours and stood where I could see the locked gates and the empty bays. I watched our crews load freight for chain stores where nothing was ever out of place on the shelves. I spoke to the detective who called himself the point of contact. He said phrases like ongoing and coordinating agencies. I didn't ask for more than what he gave. Local media called once, then again from a blocked number. I let it go to voicemail and sent the detective a note so he could keep whatever details existed in one place. People from farther away called and asked if it was the same story they had heard elsewhere. I didn't pick up. The cab was returned to us a week later. I walked out to where it sat behind the yard fence. A clean rectangle of space around it, as if it had its own gravity that discouraged anyone from parking too close. When I climbed up, the baby picture was still there with the lifted corner. and I pushed the corner down without thinking. The adhesive gave up, and the corner lifted again. I left it alone. The seat squeaked the same. The strap sound came back into my head, and then wasn't in my head at all. It came from the roof where a short section of webbing had worked itself loose and snapped against the aluminum skin in the wind. It wasn't loud, more like a small correction the night made to itself, as if something had been left untied and remembered. I reached up and tucked it in with the end of a pen and slapped my knuckles against the ceiling accidentally. They went numb with pain. The sound stopped. The quiet was worse. There were no prints that weren't ours. No sign of forced anything. The sun made patterns on the dash when it finally found us. I sat long enough to wonder if my sitting had worn a shape into the seat that would still be there. A year from now, long after the truck had a new driver, I thought about him pulling onto Route 84 many times late and unbothered, and this last time not, with some unknown set of headlights dropping back or moving up alongside, or just staying where he could feel them more than see them. I thought about how fear can make a space feel crowded, even when you are the only one in it. I thought about the rest area with sun on it earlier that day, showing its dents and stains for what they were ordinary, and how the same things under the sodium lamps turned suspect just because they were lit differently. I told the crew to leave the cab as it was until the police cleared us to clean it. I said we would not send the truck back out until later. I used words like policy and respect. One of the mechanics asked if I wanted the strap replaced because it would work loose again. I said yes, and then no, and then yes, because I couldn't decide whether I wanted to hear that sound again and call it what it was, or never hear it again and be left unsure if what I remembered was accurate. I kept waking at 3 a.m. for a while after that, the time the body chooses when it is looking for someone. I would lay in the half-dark, the digital clock a dumb rectangle. I would listen for the street's low hum, and if it wasn't there, find another sound to keep me company. Refrigerator, heat kick on, that harmless knock the pipes made when the water changed direction. If the house went too quiet, I would go to the window and look out at the nearly empty street. A patrol car would sometimes roll by, slow enough to see the outline of the officer inside, with the light of the computer on the face. Once, the car idled for a few minutes at the corner as if listening. Then it moved on. There were updates that weren't, and updates that were. Someone thought they remembered a beige sedan. Someone thought they saw a guy on foot near a sign earlier. Someone else said it was the same thing that happens in every missing person story. And maybe it was. The truth was the same size regardless. One afternoon, a month later, I drove east on 84 alone and took the rest area exit out of reflex. The place looked smaller in daylight. The vending machines were unplugged. A maintenance truck was parked crooked with its hood up. A man in a fluorescent vest was replacing a bulb in a fixture with one that would make everything the wrong color. I got out and walked to the edge where the chain link fence was. The same fence from that night. It clattered in the wind. Short bits of old police tape were still knotted at the posts, bleached into a pale thread. I put my hand in my jacket pocket and found a crumpled receipt from that night. The one I hadn't thrown away because doing so would have felt like moving on. I smoothed it and then didn't. The paper had gone soft at the folds and left a faint store dust smell on my fingers. A week after that, his wife came by the office to drop off some insurance documents. She looked different and exactly the same, like a person who had learned a silent language you could only learn by being made to. We sat at the little round table where we'd once shared birthday cake. She told me the baby had started mimicking the sound of the microwave beeping. I told her I had fixed the strap on the roof. She laughed a little and covered her mouth. Neither of those things mattered, and both did. We replaced the mirrors on the truck because the silvering had started to fog and looked like fingerprints that wouldn't wipe. We checked the sleeper locks. We changed the oil early. We did all the things you can do to a machine to suggest control over what cannot be controlled. Then the truck went back to work, because that is what trucks do, and because the lease did not pause for grief, and because waiting for certainty turns into waiting for permission to breathe. I drove it the first night myself. I took a short run, palletized dog food from a warehouse in South Windsor to a distribution center outside Hartford. Before I left the yard, I wiped the inside of the windshield with the back of my sleeve, and left a cloudy arc that only disappeared when the defroster caught up. I left just after dark and returned before midnight. Somewhere along the way, the loose strap sound came back into my head, and then didn't. The mirrors showed only my lane and the hash of headlights when they were there. Nothing unusual happened, which is what we call safety when we are trying not to call it luck. Some nights late, when the highway falls quiet for a breath and then fills again, I stand at the dock door and listen to the wind knock against the loose metal sign outside. It makes a little dull sound in the corner of my hearing, regular enough to be a heartbeat if I let it. I wait for the second knock and then the third. Sometimes there isn't one. In the morning, I unlock the office and turn on the light. White lines. The cold carried a faint dust smell, the kind that lifts off salt and old concrete when the air turns clean. The highway looked clean in the cold, the salt filmed thin enough to make the paint look chalked over. I was headed east, late, just past the Ohio River. The cab heater squeaked, the coffee in the cup holder had gone thin, like it does when it's been reheated too many times. I saw the hazard lights first, the slow metronome of amber farther up the road. A car angled on the shoulder with its nose turned slightly toward the ditch. There was movement beside it. A woman lifted her arms, waving hard. For a second I thought she'd try to run into the lane, and I eased onto the brake, checking the mirrors, feeling that small human tug that makes you do the wrong thing and the right thing at once. When I got close enough to make a choice, I took the exit ramp that came up a quarter mile after her and looped back along the frontage road. There's a spot where you can pull onto the shoulder without working against the grade, and I used it. I don't stop for stranded cars much anymore, but the way she moved fast, like she hadn't been cold until she saw headlights, put a hook in me. By the time I rolled up, she'd left the car and stood closer to the barrier, arms folded tight. She looked at me like we were halfway through a conversation I didn't remember starting. Her voice was raw. She said she'd been waiting for anyone to stop. Nothing about her was calm. She reached for the passenger door before I could say anything, and I let her in because I didn't know how not to. She told me to take the next 2 exits and then keep going. She didn't say why. She didn't say who. She smelled faintly like dryer sheets and old coffee. The cab light flicked off when I turned the key, and we were just the sound of the engine and the white lines rolling steady under us. My palms went damp and I wiped them on my jeans one at a time. That's my flaw. My hands sweat when I'm not sure. It makes small things difficult. Buttons and knobs. We merged back into the stream of cars. I kept to the right lane. She kept looking into her side mirror, which was tilted too low to be useful. The night had the clear, high look of early winter. The sky was thin as paper. A billboard flashed by for a fireworks place that only opens around holidays. Then a low cluster of warehouses with their sodium lights humming. The kind of light that makes everything beige. She started talking in fragments, the way people do when they're picking through an old fire. I learned enough to line up the facts. There had been a man, the kind who doesn't stop when told. She had tried to stop him. She had left. She had put a town between them, and then 2 more. She had changed jobs, phone numbers. He was the kind of man who would follow you. Not because he knew where you were going, but because he liked the part where you kept checking to see if he was still there. She didn't say his name. She didn't have to. A pair of headlights tucked into the far distance behind us and didn't pass. That's ordinary, I told myself. At night, most of the road is pattern. Headlights, markers, green overhead signs, exit gore points striped white. Patterns hold people together. You know what they mean. Every few minutes a reflector on the median flashed brighter than the rest, like the spacing had been changed for us and then put back. But the car didn't pass for miles. It stayed at that middling distance like it had hooked to our bumper by an invisible line. I signaled and moved to the center lane. The car followed. I moved back. So did it. When I took the next exit onto Dixie Highway in Fort Mitchell, one of a dozen similar stretches where the road names repeat and the storefronts rhyme from town to town, and then cut back toward I-75 through a cloverleaf. The car stayed with us like it had planned it. I don't drive fast, I'll take steady over fast. but I put my foot down because steady had become a kind of invitation. I swallowed and it didn't help. There's a long straight north of Walton where the highway flattens. We came into it and met a drift of fog sitting low across a dip in the road. Ground fog that glows in headlights and cuts off the world at knee height. I kept both hands at 10 and 2. She said I should exit again. The next exit was for Richwood. I put the blinker on long before I got there. You can change the way a car behind you behaves if you telegraph early enough. Sometimes, the headlights behind us swelled, like whatever sat inside the car had leaned forward. We hit the ramp. The wheel went feather light for a breath on the concrete scene, then heavy again, and the loose pin in the console tapped twice like a metronome. It curls shallow there, wide enough for semis. The concrete barrier had rub marks like graphite, where it had touched too many vehicles. The follower took it faster, tires kissing the inside seam with that rubber paint sound you feel more than hear. I took the long way through a truck stop's back lot to break the line of sight, weaving past a stack of culverts and an idle loader that smelled like hot metal in the cold. That bought us a half-minute of quiet. We cut back toward the frontage road. A train horn sounded somewhere on the far side of the freeway, long and low, like someone dragging a finger across the rim of a glass. I kept the speed low enough to make stop signs honest. The other car appeared again in the mirror, farther back than before, then near. It closed the way a dog does when it isn't sure if you're calling. I told her I was going to take us to a place with cameras. There's a speedway at Pleasant Valley, I said. It was the first time I'd given the fear anything to do. She nodded and dug her nails into the seat seam. It made a small sound, fabric under pressure. We didn't make it to Pleasant Valley. A panel van drifted across 2 lanes without looking, and I had to brake harder than I liked to keep from touching it. The follower surged into our lane, too close, then out again. I saw the driver for the first time as he drew even, a face in the gap between his A-pillar and the pasted-on streak of a tree, pale and intent, eyes fixed, no music, no phone glow on his hands. He cut in front of us and tapped his brakes. A test. People do that when they want to watch your choices. I kept space. He was looking for heat. I wasn't going to give him mine. We ran parallel to an empty strip mall. The storefront windows reflected our headlights back at us in smears. The follower slid to the shoulder and then back, like he was measuring the right distance to do something that would count. She said not to stop. I said I wouldn't. She rolled the window down an inch, like she needed air to push words out. We took a left at Mount Zion Road and blew a yellow that had been green when I measured it. In the rear view, the headlights fell away behind the crest of an overpass and then popped back up. The road surface changed to that rough aggregate they use where trucks grind up the slope, and the tires sang a little. For a stretch, there's no lighting. The dark gets honest and shows you what it has. There was nothing to see but the white lines, muted in places where folks had tracked mud, and the close ring of things not worth noticing unless you can't look away. Reflectors on a farm fence, a wind-bent sapling, the boxy silhouette of a storage container parked behind a diner that had closed 30 minutes ago. He came up tight. The first tap landed high on the tail and put a cold fizz under my ribs, the kind that makes your teeth touch by themselves. A light touch with a square bumper will take your attention out of your hands and put it in your stomach. He bumped us in the left corner and the tail moved a foot, the way a trailer does in crosswind. I let the wheel go the way it wanted for a breath, and then brought it back. My coffee cup slid and knocked into the shifter with a soft note. She said his name. Not the man in the mirror, but the man from before, and the sound of it made the cab smaller. I tried for the Boone County Sheriff's Post off Conrad. Lights mean witnesses. I cut down a side road instead of staying on the main, which was a mistake if what I wanted was an audience. The side road narrowed to a corridor of bare trees that laced over us. Their branches made a thicket of shadow on the pavement like handwriting. The fog that had lifted off the interstate had settled here in the low ground. It sat in the drainage ditch like milk. The tires crackled through sand left by a plow. My breath added its own cloud to the glass when I glanced over my shoulder. He hit us again, harder, timed to the spot where the road tilted just enough to ask a question no one on paper had to answer. The truck slid, then came back. I could smell hot brake pad and the sharp damp cold of the open window. We'd come up on a field cut close for winter, the fence wires strung tight and bright with frost. I nosed us onto the tractor path without thinking, two pale ruts running like hand-drawn lines along the fence. The frost-bright wire a ruler we were trying not to touch. The truck didn't like it. The suspension reached for something it didn't find, and then found too much. Mud grabbed and let go. The following car made the turn too late and went off the shoulder farther down, then bounded back up, headlights juddering. For a second they shone into the cabin like stage lights, and I could see every lint speck on her coat. A wooden stake too short to be a proper fence post came out of the dark and tapped the bumper. It made the small knocking sound of something domestic going wrong. We were not built for this surface. I brought us to a stop because the alternative was letting the field choose a direction. The truck's nose bobbed once and settled. The world went so quiet that I could hear the ticking of the engine cooling and the thin hiss of the heater fan. There are things you rehearse even when you tell yourself you don't. I put the truck in park and told her to slide low and reach for the glove box where I kept a handful of receipts and a thin flashlight. She did it like she had always known where it was. I stepped out and the cold hit my teeth. The pursuing car angled in behind us, not close enough to kiss the bumper, but close enough to make a meeting not optional. He left his headlights on. The light bounced off everything metal. The fence staples, the chrome trim, the wet skin of the road in a shallow sheet, and through too many shadows to count. He didn't move right away. The engine note settled, and in the pause I could hear the tiny click of cooling metal from our hood, a sound I'd only ever noticed in daylight. He opened his door, after that pause. That pause mattered. He wanted to make a shape of it. I had nothing to hold, except the feeling that I should hold something. I didn't keep weapons in the cab anymore. That was a rule I made for myself after a run of sleepless months. Instead, I wrapped my hand around the T-handle of the jack that lived under the passenger seat. A weight with purpose. It felt like it would slip because of my hands. I wiped them on my jacket and the metal went less slick. He walked toward the fence line, rather than straight at me, like he was cutting the corner of a long rectangle. He carried nothing visible. He didn't shout. He didn't point. He let the light do the work and came on in that slow, steady way that tells you someone believes in their own outcome. I told him we'd called for help and that he should leave. I didn't raise my voice. Sound carries different at night. Loud words get thin and strange. He changed course a few feet at a time, until he was almost between me and the open driver's door. That made me mad in a small, useful way. He wanted the angle. I stepped sideways and put the fence at my back. Barbs low and humming. Cold bit through my jeans into my calves. I could have run. There was nowhere to go that didn't look like him. There's a moment when two animals decide if they're going to touch. We reached it. I moved first because I didn't want to feel like he had decided that too. I didn't swing to hurt him. I swung to make a line he didn't want to cross. The jack handle hit his forearm. Metal on bone makes a sound you can feel in your teeth. He took a step back that was more about thinking than pain. His eyes weren't wild. They were bright in a way that said he had arranged the world, so this was the only thing left for him to do. He stepped again, and I stepped again, and the two steps canceled each other out. Behind me, the flashlight clicked. She'd found the switch. The beam cut a column through the fog at ankle height, and lit the crack where the fence wire passed through a warped post. It lit my boots and the dark wet on the laces where I must have stepped in a puddle. It lit his shoes cheap with the sole peeling at one corner. He looked at the light and then at me as if the beam had made the world official. The train horn sounded again, closer now, or close enough to wear the same shape. Light from the highway's curve made a faint moving band across the field where the turnpike lifted and fell. This is why I remember the white lines, not the long ones painted on the interstate, but the small ones, the fence wire glazed with frost, the seam down the center of his shirt, the nick on the jack handle running like a vein. I said we were leaving. He took one more step, and then stopped because he'd wanted me to say anything, and I had people like him, have a script, change a line, and sometimes the play pauses. We backed toward the cab without turning our backs. I kept the jack handle up, and he didn't try to close the gap in that moment. I think he wanted it to happen his way. It didn't. The cab light came on when she opened the door and then went off when it shut. The truck's seat springs complained when we fell into them. I put it in reverse, then drive. He didn't run at us. He turned his head as we moved, like a cat watching a bird that decides to hop rather than fly. We bumped back onto the road proper and took the first street with a name. Turfway Road, like a lifeline. On my right, the dark wing of the airport sat with red lights marking edges you can't see. I pulled into a grocery lot, still lit though the store had closed. The kind with long light bars over every lane, and carts chained in a line near the entrance. The kind with tall poles and lenses tucked under each light cap. Cameras make strangers behave, or at least make them pick a different corner. I kept moving until we were near the returns corral with its rounded bars. I called. I gave the mile markers, then the cross street. I said there had been contact. I said he was still behind us, and then I said he wasn't, because when I looked, he had gone the other way, or maybe he hadn't and I'd lost track. The operator asked me to repeat the street name. I did. My voice sounded like I was telling a story someone else had told me once. We waited. Waiting turns minutes into stitches holding pieces together. A cruiser rolled in slow after a long 5 minutes. Lights off, then turned them on after it had stopped, which is the opposite of what you see on television. The officer stayed in the car a beat longer than I expected, then opened his door. He came to us measured, not cautious exactly, but in a way that left room for things to be normal again if they wanted. He asked for the basics, and we gave the parts we could say. He took notes and kept glancing toward the road like we were a radio station he was making sure stayed on frequency. Another unit went by toward the interstate. Lights on, siren off. The fog had thinned and the air felt like biting into an apple. We stepped out enough for him to look at the bumper and the smear of dirt that wasn't ours on the paint. He touched it with the back of his fingers the way mechanics do when they're deciding if a thing is hot. He made a small mark in his notebook, like a check mark you put next to something in a grocery aisle. They didn't find him that night. Maybe they found him later. There are things you hear after the fact, and they come in pieces from people who don't know they're telling you the part you need. When I did hear more, it was enough to confirm the shape of what had been following us. It didn't make the shape smaller. I didn't see the woman again after winter. She moved. I kept going. You keep going because the road is a job, and because the road is the only thing that looks the same every morning. The white lines do what they do. They mark the world into manageable pieces and ask you to stay inside. When I come up past Florence now, when the morning is as bare as steel and the trucks thread through each other like fish in a narrow channel, I notice my grip on the wheel, and I make myself loosen it. I lower the heater fan 1 notch so the cab goes a little quieter, and I run my thumb over the leather seam of the steering wheel. Sometimes I click the turn signal 3 times before I change lanes, just to watch the green arrow tick in the cluster like a small private lighthouse. The seam is a white line too if you look close. It keeps its shape. The road doesn't remember you. That's the comfort and the trouble. It will show you the same things whether or not you're ready. I measure exits early. I leave room. I watch for the patterns that don't pass. I try not to talk to them in my head. Some nights I think I hear a train where there isn't one. The long note pulled out of a winter sky, and I breathe until it's only the fan again. The tires again. The white lines running from somewhere to somewhere like nothing bad ever learned how to follow. I turn. Dry County. I was running west on a late load. The kind you take because the dispatcher sounds desperate, and you tell yourself the miles will even out. It was after midnight, and the air had that brittle feel of a dry front. The vent brushed my knuckles cool, then warmer, like it couldn't decide which side of the weather to keep. The radio hissed in and out between farm reports and a tired song from 10 years ago. I kept my window cracked a finger width for the slip of cooler air, and the faint smell of cut grass along the ditches. West of the Panhandle sprawl. The highway thinned and the shoulders went narrow, near a run of pasture land you could mistake for any county out there. I passed one of those blue signs promising fuel in so many miles, and counted down because the gauge always feels jumpier when it's dark. The sky was clear, no moon, just a smear of stars fighting the spill from my headlights. The asphalt ahead flickered with the heat ghosts you see when you're tired, the ones that make you blink and recheck your mirrors to be sure nothing is actually there. At a rest area, I pulled in because my knee had started to ache, a dumb little twinge that flares up on long hauls. The lot had 4 rigs scattered wide and a cluster of passenger cars near the vending machines. The building sat low and plain with a line of soda logos lit up along the glass. I left the engine idling. Habit. The air from the vent hit my knuckles and dried the sweat I hadn't noticed. I told myself I'd stretch, hit the bathroom, grab a candy bar to keep the energy steady. Inside it was bright and too clean, that lemon cleaner bite mixing with the sugar fog of the snack machines. A janitor pushed a mop at the far end and looked past me like I wasn't there. The mirror over the sinks had a crack at one corner that threw a double image of my face. I avoided it and focused on the practical things. When I came back out with a bottled coffee and a bag of pretzels, the lot felt different, like someone had moved a chair half an inch in a room you know well. A receipt skittered along the painted line and caught against my tire, the paper twitching in the fan of a passing car. The cleaner smell thinned near the door, replaced by warm asphalt and sugar. A coupe with a dented door rolled slow past my cab. It didn't park. It drifted, looped, drifted again, then settled 2 spaces back and to the side. Nothing illegal, nothing to say anything about. I told myself not to make it into a thing. I climbed in, locked the door out of habit, and set my coffee in the console. When I turned off the radio to listen to the engine, I heard a car door on that slight delay you get through glass. A voice, then a reply, low enough I couldn't catch words. My knee twinged again. I told myself to quit making a story out of people living their lives. I put it in gear and eased out. The coupe's headlights swung on, and they followed my lane back to the interstate. I didn't look directly. I watched their form in the side mirror, the way they hung 2 lengths back and 1 over, sitting in the blind spot where you can't look without committing to it. I merged and took the right lane. They merged and took the right lane and settled at that uneasy distance where their engine was a different pitch than mine, a faint burr that climbed when I didn't. It sat under everything. I let them stay there. Miles stretched. The road signs came and went in green flashes. Exits for farm roads, a county line, a service area that never looked open even when it was. The coupe kept its place. No pass, no full drop. I tried a simple check, tapped the brake enough to show lights, then eased up again. Their response came a beat later, like they were watching my lights instead of the road. It could have been innocent. It could have been me building a knot where there wasn't one. The wind through the cracked window had gone colder. It dried my lips and I licked at a spot and made it worse. I reached for the water bottle from earlier and knocked it into the footwell where it rolled and thunked against the plastic. The sound felt too loud. I kept my eyes forward and my hand steady. When the next exit sign came, I made a decision I would tell myself I had been planning anyway. Though I hadn't, I took it. This was a county road that ran toward low hills. The asphalt turned to that rougher chip seal that hums different under your tires, and even burr that got under the sound of the engine. There were reflectors, not many, and a few fence posts with the kind of wire that snags if you're not careful. The coupe followed off the ramp. That settled something I had been pretending was not a question. I didn't speed. I held a calm pace and let the darkness make its own space. A cluster of radio towers blinked in the distance, red lights marking a ridgeline. Between here and there, the land folded into arroyos and scrub. I knew the general map of the region. Not this road, not the little names on the mailboxes that would be out here. I kept to the center where I could. The coupe's headlights bounced behind me on the uneven grade. They let a gap open and closed it again. I turned the dial and killed my cabin light, which I'd left low. The dash went dimmer. The plastic of the wheel felt dry under my palms. A chalky texture you only notice when you stop flexing your grip. The sensation of being watched stayed in place. After a few bends, I saw a sign for a county maintenance yard. It pointed to a spur that angled away, a narrower path with a cattle guard and a line of windbreak trees. I slowed and took that. The coupe took the main road and kept on for a dozen yards before their brake lights glowed and came to a stop. They sat there, lights washing the bushes pale, and their beams drifted once across a reflector post like they were checking a map or looking for a number that wasn't posted. They didn't reverse. They didn't follow on to the spur. I didn't want to test whether they would. If I lingered, I took the spur past the cattle guard. The fence on one side had 3 stands of barbed wire and a gate chained with a lock. Someone had spray painted blue. I rolled onto a turnaround where a grader and a dump truck sat in the dark. The gravel there had a different crunch, coarser under my tires. I backed my rig into the shadow of the grader and killed my lights. I edged until the grader's blade hid my front corner from the road and straightened the trailer by inches so the reflectors wouldn't catch stray light. Then I killed everything. I put the truck in neutral, set the brake, and sat with both hands pressed flat on the wheel until they tingled. The first minute stretched thin. I listened for an engine that never came. I turned off the fan and the sudden quiet made my breath sound too close. The dominant noise was the cooling tick of my exhaust, and beyond that the dry rattle of leaves in the windbreak. An insect, something with a loud steady pulse, took up a rhythm. It wasn't crickets here. It was a high, constant whir that made the hair on my arms feel lifted. Every faint push of air ticked through the windbreak like a zipper half closed. I tried one deep breath and swallowed wrong, coughed once, just a small sound, and scolded myself like I was a kid. Time passed and nothing happened that I could point to. It would have been easier if something had. The mind likes details to stack. In the mirror, the maintenance yard office sat dark. A plastic chair leaned crooked against the wall, near a soda machine that had no lights inside it. The chair made me think of someone on a break with his ankles crossed, and I had to push that picture away because it wasn't useful. When the insect whir shifted, either because the wind changed or because I'd stopped hearing it in the same way, I decided it was enough. Staying felt like hunting trouble. The highway had people, light, noise, other lives. I turned the key and let the engine come back in soft, then full. I waited. Nobody pulled in. The red lights on the towers blinked their steady, slow pattern. I put it in gear and rolled back toward the cattle guard. On the main road, I paused just long enough to check both directions. To the right, there was a grade climbing toward the ridge. To the left, it fell back toward the interstate. No headlights either way. I took the left and let my speed rise to something that felt like trust. The air through the cracked window lifted the sweat at my collar. I kept my eyes moving ahead. Mirror, gauge, ahead. The interstate appeared where it should have. A ribbon of light in motion. I merged in behind a refrigerated trailer hauling something like dairy, because the unit on the front had that low, even tone particular to those loads. The reefer unit kept its workman hum, and every so often the crosswind shaved the tone a note thinner, like air passing a bottle's lip. I hung there and let the rhythm of traffic take me. The coupe never reappeared. My shoulder dropped a fraction lower, and I hadn't known I was holding it tight. The next truck stop I took was the kind with a restaurant open all night, and a laundry room that smelled like detergent even with the door closed. Big light standards washed the lot in an even white. I backed between 2 sleepers and made sure my swing cleared their mirrors. The relief that came when I set the brake was simple and plain and took nothing from anyone else. Inside the building, it was bright with a different kind of clean, a diner shine built from coffee and tile, and the sound of plates stacked and unstacked. I ordered coffee at the counter and wrapped both hands around the paper cup, while it was too hot to drink. A woman a few stools down counted out cash for scratch tickets and told the clerk she always picked the ones with birds on them. Someone left a jacket on a chair, and a man came back for it 2 minutes later and smiled like he'd been reunited with something bigger. Small lives continued. A driver in a faded ball cap spooned eggs without looking up from his phone, and someone laughed at a scratch-off that won back the price of the ticket. When I went back to my cab, I cracked the sleeper curtain but didn't get in. I sat in the driver's seat and turned the radio down low, not to listen but to have other noise. The wind that had dried the ditches earlier had died. Through the cracked window, I couldn't hear the insects here. just the hum of the refrigerated unit next door, and the occasional air brake cough from someone settling in. I didn't sleep much. A few uneven stretches, then the hollow wakefulness that comes when you expect a knock or a tap that never arrives. My mind ran loops. The coupe's headlights in the mirror, the maintenance yard gate with its blue lock, the idea of a voice that might have said something distinct and didn't. I let those images go as best I could. They had no more detail to yield. They had the shape of caution and nothing else. By dawn, the light came thin and clean, and the sky over the pumps went pale. A pair of sparrows argued over a crumb near a trash can. I rinsed my cup and threw it away and checked the straps on my trailer like always, running a palm along the webbing for fray. I noted a scuff on a corner cap and wiped off the chalk dust with my sleeve. The normal morning list steadied me. I got back on the interstate and nudged the rig to cruise. The land opened, the towers gone behind me, the ridges leveled into long fields. The night felt like a room I had closed softly. It stayed shut as I moved away. I don't know who was in that coupe. I don't know what they wanted, if they wanted anything. It isn't a story that ends with a reason. It ends because I chose the road with fewer people at the right moment, and then returned to the one with more. The relief sat with me, quiet and earned. The not knowing stayed too, like a low sound under other sounds, something you only hear when you turn everything else down. Cold air, blue light. I'd been on the road since before sunrise, hauling produce east out of Portland. By the time the sky turned that hard late winter blue, and the freeway sign started counting down to Pendleton, my shoulders buzzed from the hours of sitting. I pulled off at a rest area lookout above the Umatilla River, the kind of state-run spot with 2 vending machines and a map so faded you have to guess at the county lines. The air had that cut glass bite that finds the gap at your collar. I eased the rig into the long truck lane, killed the lights and set the brakes. A small silver sedan idled 3 spaces down with its fog lights on. Beyond it, somebody's dog nosed at a frozen strip of grass and pawed at a cigarette butt like it was a prize. I grabbed my old knit cap from the passenger seat and a bottle of water from the cooler, opened the door and stepped down into the cold. The first thing I noticed was the sound the vending machine made. A soft, tired hum overlaying the whisper of freeway tires. Then movement at the shadow edge where the lot met scraggly pines. A woman mid-30s maybe, standing too still, arms wrapped around herself like she was trying to hold heat in. Her hair was pulled into a knot that had surrendered to flyaways. The way she looked past me before she looked at me made me slow a little. There are certain looks you learn to read on the road, the brittle ones, the angry ones, the kind that means trouble that doesn't belong to you but might hitch a ride anyway. She stepped out as I reached the curb, her tennis shoes scuffing salt. "Please," she said, breath fogging. "My partner, he called me. He's at the urgent care in town. He can't breathe. I don't have a ride. Can you?" Her voice caught. For a half second I saw the 2 paths. Go inside, get a ranger. Keep my world neat and narrow. Or say yes and let my world widen into somebody else's emergency. The cold sank through my jeans. The dog across the lot barked once and lost interest. I said I could drive her. She nodded like she'd been holding herself together for exactly that answer. In the cab, the heater clicked to life slow as an old man getting up from a chair. She held her hands near the vent. Up close, she smelled like dryer sheets and a little stale sweat, the kind of smell a long day leaves on you. She said to call her Mara. The man was Joel to the clinic, and on his forms, she added, though paperwork names didn't seem to matter much in that moment. She used partner like it had weight, like it meant something that had been tested. She said he'd been dizzy since the afternoon, that he'd told her his chest was tight and his arm felt wrong, that she'd stayed with him for a while and then driven to the rest area to clear her head. The way she said clear my head made me keep my eyes on the road. The after-hours clinic just off Court Avenue kept its lobby lights on past regular hours. A spill of brightness you could see from the corner. He'd told her on the phone that the nurse there had advised him to come in if he could, and that was the last place she knew to aim for. We hit 2 lights, both red, and waited while nobody crossed. The heater finally got ahead of the cold. At the second light, she pinched the fleshy part of her palm with her opposite thumb, as if that could keep the rest of her from shaking. When we pulled into the lot, the glass doors were lit from inside, the kind of clinical brightness that makes tired eyes ache. I rolled into the patient drop-off lane and put the truck in park. She was out before I could say anything, half running, half stumbling across the painted arrows. I killed the engine and followed at a slower walk. The automatic doors opened with that gentle, compliant slide, and a wash of warm, dry air met me, smelling faintly of alcohol wipes and lemon floor cleaner. As the doors parted, a thin draft slipped out, carrying the soft tangle of air handlers and something faintly medicinal, a low, even breath from the building. The lobby chairs were molded plastic in 3 colors, pretending to be cheerful. A muted TV showed a cooking show where someone plated tiny radishes with tweezers. At the reception window, a woman in scrubs looked up with a practiced smile, and then passed me toward the doors. One beat of pause before her eyes moved back. I asked if a man named Joel had come in with chest pain. She said there had been a call, there had been a name, but the man hadn't made it in, as if she could feel the next questions forming. She pointed toward a hallway and told me they'd gotten word from the ambulance. I didn't like how my mouth went dry. We turned down the hall. The rubberized floor damped our footsteps. A wall clock clicked once. Around the corner, in a stretch of corridor outside a closed exam room. She was there. Mara, on the floor with her back against the wall, knees drawn up almost to her chest. Her head was tipped forward, and her hair fell like a curtain that needed a hand to lift it. A nurse stood about 10 feet away, not looking at her, looking instead at a paper on a clipboard she held at her side. People give you that space when nothing you can say will connect to anything. I took a step, and then stopped. There are shapes your body understands even before your brain catches up. The nurse lifted her eyes to me, and then to Mara, and gave a small shake of the head. No big gestures, just the smallest movement that said what needed saying. I imagined her doing that several times a night. I didn't approach Mara. It didn't feel like I had a right. She made a sound that wasn't a word. After a moment, she drew in a breath that shuddered at the edges. Time did a strange thing then. It narrowed to the squeak of a rubber heel somewhere behind a door, a printer spitting one page, the compressor buzzed from a fridge unit. I stood there and let my hands hang useless at my sides. When she finally spoke, she kept her eyes on a spot at the baseboard. She said she didn't want to go home without him. The words were flat, like she was describing the weather. Then she stopped and touched the heel of her hand to her mouth, not to stop tears, but like she was checking her face for a piece that had come loose. I told her I could take her back to where I'd picked her up, if she wanted. She didn't nod exactly. It was smaller than that. On the way back to the freeway, she sat with one foot tucked under the other leg, like she was trying to keep herself in one place. The town rolled past the pawn shop again, a shuttered diner with a mural of a river curling along its brick, a bus stop sign that looked taller at night. I kept both hands at 10 and 2, and avoided the pothole I knew at the corner by habit. We merged onto the on-ramp, and the lanes opened like a book laid flat. At the bottom of the grade by the river bridge, a crosswind pushed at us and the cab shifted a fraction, like a hand laid against the door. The blower kept its steady note as I eased a touch off the throttle. She put her hand against the dash like a rider steadying herself. "I did something I can't take back," she said. Not the words I expected, but the shape of them was familiar. "I put something in his glass. I thought." She didn't finish. I watched my knuckles go pale and then color back in. The tires sang their steady song. In 9 years, I'd seen people pulled from ditches, a man sleeping on top of his car in a flood basin, a kid trying to back a horse trailer with more confidence than skill. I'd seen small, stupid lies and big old pride. I hadn't sat with someone who said something like that in a warm cab under the freeway lamps, the road unspooling like tape. It felt like standing too close to a live wire. I thought of the reception nurse's tiny shake of the head, the shape it made. We didn't talk after that. There are silences that open, and there are silences that hold shut like a jar. When the sign for the rest area came up, a little green promise in the dark, I put my blinker on early out of habit. Back in the lot, the silver sedan was gone. The dog was gone too. The mat board threw a rectangle of light on an empty bench. I idled by the curb long enough for her to open the door. She stepped down slowly in that careful way you do when you've had to think about walking. She didn't look back. I watched her cross the painted arrows and disappear between a pair of picnic tables into the deeper dark beyond the lamps, as if she knew exactly where she was going. I shut the passenger door she'd left slightly ajar, and sat there with the engine running until the heat turned too much. The right thing, it turned out, didn't look like much. I sat with my thumb hovering a second, then called the non-emergency line for the county, gave the rest area by the river overlook and the time window as best I could, along with the make and color of the car I'd noticed earlier. The dispatcher took the details and then repeated them back, each word even after I killed the engine and the cab ticked as metal relaxed. My water bottle had fallen into the footwell and rolled against the rubber mat, making a soft bump with each impatient shift of my foot. When I reached for the bottle the first time, my fingers skated off the cold plastic. The cab's quiet tick and the faint blower bleed in the vents were louder with the radio off. I fished the bottle out and took a sip that tasted like plastic in the freezer chest. Across the lot, a man in a reflective vest refilled the blue dicer bin with a shovel. He paused once and leaned on the handle. You can watch a person take a breath even from across a stretch of asphalt. I pulled my cap down over my ears, folded my arms, and let the truck's gentle shake remind me I was still here. In the morning, the air would smell like diesel and coffee, and the dogs would be back, and the vending machine hum would get swallowed by daytime. Stories pile up like straps in the side box, useful, weight-bearing, eventually frayed. Some of them you take out and check and coil up again. Some you carry without touching. That night, even after the dash went dark, there was still a wash of blue from the instruments that took a while to fade. Rest area, mile marker 72. I was hauling produce north along I-84, late September, coming out of the desert and into the cool Idaho night. The radio had turned into a wash of distant stations and hiss, so I shut it off and let the drone of the tires fill the cab. I'd been up too long. The mirrors kept showing me the same empty lanes. My eyes burned. When the sign for a rest area flashed out of the dark, one of those small ones east of Mountain Home, I took the exit without thinking about it. It was close to midnight, and felt colder than it should have. The lot was half lit by poles with sodium lamps that turned everything the color of old paper. The light had a dry buzz to it. The air felt a little colder than the dashboard had promised. There were 2 compact cars and a pickup parked near the picnic tables. The building sat low, squared off like a utility box, with a row of doors facing the lot and a narrow strip of native grass behind it. A vending machine hummed against one wall. I nosed the tractor into a spot along the far edge and set the brake. The engine calmed, then fell quiet. I climbed into the sleeper without taking off my boots and stretched out with my jacket over my chest. I kept a tire iron within reach, more out of habit than fear. I woke because something in the quiet had shifted. The cab didn't feel like mine for a second, like someone else was in it holding their breath with me. A sound came, soft at first, then too precise to be wind or settling plastic. The passenger door handle clicked. It clicked again, faster, a nervous little rhythm, then rattled hard as if someone was testing it through impatience. I froze with my hand on the tire iron and listened to my own breath fog up the air in front of my face. The lock held, the rattling stopped. Rubber soles scraped on gravel. Whoever it was moved along the step and down, then away. I pushed the curtain aside with 2 fingers. The lot looked undisturbed under the lamps. I almost thought I'd imagined it until I caught motion near the building. Someone crossing the concrete walkway toward the restroom doors. Not a heavy stride. Something off about the way their weight shifted at the hips, like they were favoring one side or carrying something against their ribs. Somewhere near the building, a fluorescent held a thin, uneven buzz, like a speaker left on with nothing to play. I could have started the truck and gone back to the highway. I thought about the miles still to make in the delivery window and how none of this would look reasonable written up on a form. Instead, I slid down from the bunk, eased the driver's door open, just enough to slip through, and stepped onto the step rail. The night smelled damp from the sprinkler system and faintly of hot metal cooling. I dropped to the gravel and closed the door with my hip until the latch caught without a slam. I didn't go straight to the building. I took the long way along the grass berm where a low chain link fence separated the rest area from the highway easement. A truck went by out on the interstate, and the fence wires throbbed once with the sound. The vending machine hummed louder here, a steady note that hid small noises. I kept the tire iron down by my leg. The lamps cast odd shadows. A picnic table turned into a black tangle, then back into wood and bolts. Near the restroom doors, a motion sensor should have thrown extra light. It didn't. The head buzzed like a tired ballast, half awake. The cone of coverage stuttering on a delay that never finished. I stood in the fringe and watched the narrow white door marked family for any movement. The sound that had woken me came again, softer now, not a whisper, more like cloth against a metal hinge. Then a thud that didn't ring. Something set down. Then the hard suck of a latch that wasn't the right door. I realized the utility closet beside the restrooms had a separate handle, the kind you had to pull with your fingertips. I stepped closer. The concrete still held the day's heat. Through the door to the men's room came no sound, but the low multiple echo that exists in tiled places, even when they're empty. I placed my palm against the door and felt the air current warmer coming out than the night. I pushed it open an inch. The fluorescent lights hummed in a way that made the tiles feel a little closer than they were. A hand dryer blinked a dead LED. No shoes visible under the stall partitions. I stepped inside, let the door swing, waited, listened. A fly bumped weakly against the high window. On the sink, a paper towel had been twisted into a tightrope and unwound, leaving a damp spiral and a faint ridge in the pulp where fingers had pinched too hard. I don't know why that bothered me. The room smelled like disinfectant and something else older that never quite left. I backed out and let the door close. Outside again, the dim lamp buzzed and did not change its mind. I moved toward the utility closet door without touching it. A fresh scuff marked the paint at the level of a belt buckle. The padlock hung on its hasp, latched but not actually locked through. The shackle was cool and slightly gritty with flaked paint. When I lifted it, it made a small nickel-on-ceramic sound in my fingers. I stood a little to the side and tapped the door with the tire iron. No answer. I lifted the padlock, eased it out, and pocketed it without opening the door yet. Footsteps shifted on gravel behind me. I turned my head without showing it, looked past the picnic tables to the pickup. A shape rose from the bed and eased onto the ground, then hunched to the side where the lamps fell away. Whoever it was stopped, as if feeling me look, then melted into the dark strip along the far hedge. I pulled the utility door open. The smell hit first. Bleach and something wet that was not water. The metal edge was cool, the paint chalky under my palm. A mop leaned in a bucket with gray strings, the handle propped with a rubber band against the shelving. The shelves held plastic bottles, a roll of contractor bags, a folded orange vest, and a small cardboard box labeled with a word that had been blacked out by marker until the fibers feathered. In the back corner behind the mop was a duffel. It was small and scuffed and unzipped a few inches. The zipper pull had a keyring on it with a charm shaped like a shoe. I didn't touch the duffel. The thing that put the skin tight around my skull was the fact that the mop bucket was dry but the mop strings were wet. I backed up without closing the door and stood in the doorway, listening past the hum of the lights and the vending machine and the far-off tire noise from the highway. The wind didn't move. The chain-link fence thrummed once, and then again. Not the wind. Something tapping it and letting it ring. The pickup's tailgate creaked a fraction. I took 2 steps into the darkness beside the building where the soda machine ended, and the brick took over. The tire iron felt too slick in my palm, so I adjusted my grip and the iron bit into callus. A voice came from the far side of the picnic table, a single syllable that flattened in the air and went out. I felt my own breath hold and then leave in a thin plume. The utility door had no closer. The gap between door and frame kissed back and forth a millimeter, making the softest tick. Each small tick from the gap seemed to answer the vending machine's steady note. 2 metronomes a fraction off. I pushed it shut and slipped the padlock back through, but didn't click it. It looked closed again. The duffel sat wherever it had been left. The mop dripped nothing. I went back to the truck. I didn't run. My boots scuffed and paused and scuffed. Around the vending machine corner, I slowed more and looked into the glass. Reflection gave me the lot backward, the pickup, the 2 cars, the dark hedge, the white stripe of painted curb. Something in the reflection moved that wasn't me. I turned quickly and saw only still shapes. The soda machine thumped as its compressor kicked over. At the cab, I opened the driver's door and put my foot on the step. Somewhere behind me, the fence gave one brief, lazy note and then settled. A breath of air lifted the edge of the curtain inside my sleeper. I could have imagined that. I set the tire iron on the seat and climbed in. Before I closed up, I leaned down and slid my flashlight from the door pocket. The batteries rattled loosely. I flicked it on. The beam went weak, brightened once, then turned into a circular bruise. I smacked it against my palm. It steadied enough to throw a cone. I swept the lot with the beam. It picked out the torn corner of a chip bag, the dull brass of a bolt head on the picnic table, the white throat of a reflector on the signpost. The hedge swallowed the light. In the darkness there, I saw the suggestion of a shoulder turn and then flatten. My pulse climbed into my throat and sat there, small and hard, refusing to move. I didn't call out. I pulled the door in until it latched and then turned the lock down with my thumb. The sound of the lock sliding into place was louder than it should have been. I started the engine. The dash lights woke. The hum under my feet steadied me. I checked the mirrors. The driver's side gave me a wide view of the lot, the vending machine, the bathroom doors. In the passenger mirror, the pickup's shape seemed closer than I remembered. I told myself that was perspective. I took the truck out of gear and released the brakes slowly so it wouldn't shout. The rig rolled a foot. In the passenger mirror, a figure that hunched again, that careful, unfluid movement, detached from the shadow at the tailgate and took 2 steps toward my cab, then stopped like a deer when a branch cracks underfoot. I put it back in gear and steered toward the exit. The figure faded from the mirror as the angle changed. A second shape stood up from behind the low hedge along the exit lane, and the fence sang once in a low, tired note. That was enough. I didn't look again. I eased over the expansion joints of the exit, then merged onto the interstate with the turn signal flicking like a metronome. Sleeper light off, cabin light off, radio off, engine steady. For 10 miles I felt pursued by an idea rather than a vehicle. The mirrors held only me in a spread of anonymous lights. Then a pair of headlights lined up behind me and stayed there without gaining. When I changed lanes to bypass a slower truck, the pair changed with me. When I signaled back, it did too, a beat later than me, which is not a crime and not proof. The road carried us into a shallow grade cut through low hills, where the sound changes because the air piles up. My scalp prickled as if each hair were a sensor. I told myself to be adult about it. At the next exit 90 for Mountain Home, I signaled and took the ramp down into the service lights. If the headlights followed, I'd take another ramp quickly back onto the highway and let the distance do its work. If they didn't, the feeling would have to find a new reason to exist. The ramp curved under a cleanly painted overpass. I watched my mirror. The pair of headlights did not take the exit. They dwindled past and continued west. I pulled into a chevron off Airbase Road near the overpass, the kind of bright island every corridor town has. I parked under the canopy and let the engine idle until my hands unclenched. The night had lost some of its grip here. The cashier's booth sat behind glass with that blue late-hour life inside. A man in a denim jacket leaned against the ice freezer and read the back of a package of jerky like it mattered to someone. I turned the engine off and sat with my fingers on the keys for a second longer than normal. Inside, the smell was coffee and rubber tires and lemon cleaner. I poured a coffee and added too much powdered creamer. My hand shook once, a small scrape of cup against dispenser. That would be my tell if anyone asked. A woman in a reflective vest with a ponytail tucked through the back of a ball cap stood near the coolers and looked at me for half a second longer than eye contact requires. She looked away and opened a Gatorade and stood there drinking it without paying yet. If there was a story here, it didn't bring itself to the counter. When I came back out, I sat on the step rail with the coffee and let the heat find my palms. I watched the highway lights in the distance like you watch a river for debris. The hum here was softer. The canopy lights handled the darkness for you. After a few minutes, a state trooper car slid in near the far pump and idled. It sat there long enough for the fan to cycle twice before the door opened, and the trooper stepped out, stretched, and headed for the door. It idled with the windows up. When the engine fan cut off, he wrote something on a pad, then got out and stretched his back. As he walked in, he tipped his chin once in that neutral way that says you're only work if you make yourself work. I finished half the coffee and poured the rest into the bushes in a thin white arc, then crumpled the lid and slid it into the door pocket. The heat had made my hands feel ordinary again. I checked the passenger handle out of an old reflex. It was locked. My shoulder ached now that I could afford to feel it. I got back into the cab, closed the door, and set the tire iron where it belonged. I took a breath and then another, and thought about the duffel I had not touched and the mop that could not have made itself wet. I didn't call anyone. I could have asked the clerk to phone in a welfare check at the rest area. But I told myself there was no clear thing to report besides a feeling, and a lock that wasn't locked by choice. I told myself the trooper was here, and could figure out what was his business. The trucker version of confession is the quiet decision not to complicate the route. I pulled back onto I-84 and let the miles spool out. The chain-link fence behind my eyes sang once more, and then stopped. By the time the sky went gray over the prairie, I had downgraded the night to a story I would not tell exactly. I counted mile markers and let the numbers sift my thoughts. There is a way you sit when you are trying not to think about something. I did that. The road offered its usual answers. You passed. You kept going. There were no flashing lights in your mirror. At a way station near Glenn's Ferry, a raven hopped along the guardrail and raised one wing as if to show me a pocket. I laughed once at nothing. It sounded normal. The day put a lid on the hours between. The cab warmed. The engine kept the pitch it always keeps. The hedges at the rest area could have been a line of sage if I let them be. The only thing that kept floating back was the spiral of damp on the sink counter. It was such a small thing to fixate on. I knew that. I kept seeing a hand twisting paper, and then letting it unfurl. The image sat inside me like a coin under the tongue, dissolving no faster for the miles. I made Portland before sundown, and backed into the dock with my usual 2 pull-ups and 1 correction. A guy in a forklift tapped the horn twice and I startled like I hadn't slept. I signed the paperwork and smiled when I was supposed to. When the warehouse door slammed down behind the last pallet, the sound came back like that first latch in the night. I told myself to stop inventing meaning. On the drive to the truck stop, the radio found a song I used to like. I let it play. I've been in and out of 100 small rest areas since then. Most of them are tired squares of concrete with a drift of dried leaves in the corners and a map on the wall that has lost its title. I still stop. You have to. I lock both doors every time, even if I'm only using the sink or stretching my back. I keep the tire iron in the same place. Sometimes I reach for it when I don't need to, like a person touches their wallet to make sure it's still theirs. On the best nights, nothing happens except the machine and the road and the place you're headed. On other nights, the fence rings once, and you remember how thin a door can feel.